Hello friends! Welcome back to another episode of Reddit ProRevenge. I've got 3 stories for you in this episode that I hope you'll enjoy. As always, I hope you stay for all the stories and subscribe for future videos. Teachers are supposed to teach, right? Not make you feel dumb about not knowing something and making fun of you in front of the whole class. This one's titled, "The Time I Ruined My High School Teacher's Career and Got Her Fired in the Greatest Way Possible." Backstory: I was a senior in high school at the time, and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student, and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important, because to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for almost a decade and was widely known for being a petty heartless bitch who the administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which was my worst subject, so naturally, I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some, these questions are easily answered, but to me, it was rocket science. Usually, when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again. Wow, surprise, surprise, you don't understand it again? Really? We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" I tried going to the administration about it, but again, she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class. She would act respectful and normal for one day and go back to being a bitch the next. This goes on for about half the year, until I had enough. I went to the local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. Fast forward to the end of the year, and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote because it's been burned into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for over 10 years, and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes in one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal, and we listened to a couple of insults before he stopped me. He told me we would meet the next day, where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walk into the school the next morning, being the most nervous I've ever been for anything. I was called down to the office, where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Frank. What follows was some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators turned furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Frank go from confident and stuck up to her realizing that she'd fucked up beyond repair. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment, and the principal turns to me and says, "I think we've heard everything we need to. Thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back, and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes as I gave the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week, and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school, and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired, and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of her connections that she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially because no school in the district area would hire this walking piece of garbage. If you're reading this, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you to go fuck yourself. Sometimes, the best revenge is doing the right thing. This story's titled, "My Worst Job Ever." When I was fresh out of high school, my sister's boyfriend offered me a job as a mechanic at a local dealership. The job was an apprenticeship and was at one of the worst dealerships I've ever had the displeasure of working at. I could tell you dozens of stories about being an apprentice that would discourage anyone from taking up the position. However, I feel like my experience can be summed up in 3 examples of mistreatment. A 4th-year apprentice was taking a gearbox out of a small car, probably weighs about 30 kilograms or 60 pounds. He told me to catch the gearbox as it came out of the car while he undid the last bolt. I told him there was no way that I'm catching a falling mass that was that heavy. He told me that I would get sacked if I didn't do what I was told. A fool could have seen it coming. The gearbox fell, I was unable to catch it, and the casing broke on the ground as it landed. The foreman came by and blamed me for the incident. My wages were docked to pay for the gearbox housing. I was later humiliated by another apprentice who filmed the entire event on his camera phone. Basically, it was me trying horribly to catch it, as I predicted. In another incident, I was asked to retrieve 2 tires from the cage, a literal lockable chicken wire cage about 10 square meters large and 4 meters high, to fit a vehicle. To collect the tires, I needed to climb a ladder to get them from the top rack. As I was up there, I heard the gate close and lock, and one of the mechanics had locked me in the cage as part of a hazing ritual. It was about 35 degrees, 100 Fahrenheit that day, and I was locked in there for 2 hours. Whenever a mechanic came past and saw that I was in the cage, they would take a nearby fire hose and try to hose me down in there. By the time I got out of the cage, I had such bad sunburn that I couldn't come into work the next day because I was still vomiting from the heat stroke. My boss did not approve the time off, and I was given leave without pay. For the final story, there was an incident where we recovered a bumper, or fender. We used to save these bumpers in case we ever dented one, so we had spares essentially. I was asked to place the bumper on 2 hooks, and then climb a ladder to the top of the workstation, and hang the bumper on the rafters at the top of the workshop for storage. I don't know if you've ever tried to climb a ladder with no hands, while holding a large and heavy load, but I assure you, it's difficult. As I was climbing the ladder, it started slipping on the greasy workshop floor, and eventually collapsed under me, causing me to fall 4 meters, about 15 feet, dropping the bumper, injuring my hand, and resulting in me once again being humiliated by a mechanic who was filming the whole ordeal. I was told that it was my fault, that I fell off the ladder because I wasn't doing it right. I should note that I had asked another apprentice to hold the bottom of the ladder, and they had neglected to do so. Suffice to say, I was sick of how this company operated, so I spent the next 2 weeks taking photos of unsafe work practices. I took photos of lots of things, including people using a grinder with no guards, no goggles, and no gloves, people smoking next to open fuel sources, an apprentice locked in a grease pit, another hazing ritual, and yes, I opened it after taking the photo. 2 apprentices moving a heavy piece of shop machinery into storage by pushing it up a flimsy wooden ramp. Apprentices working at heights without railings. Haz-chem materials that were stored, well, anywhere, not locked up. You get the idea. I sent the photos along with some accounts of my personal experiences and anecdotal evidence of other unsafe practices to WorkSafe, a government body that fines workplaces for unsafe practices and ensures that they clean their act up. The company that I worked for received over $100,000 in fines and had to spend probably another $25,000 in repairs to bring their workshop up to spec. The local mechanics union became involved too and caused problems around the treatment of apprentices and unsafe work practices in general. This place is still the largest employer of apprentices in my area, but I hear they treat people a lot better now. Some teachers can be downright mean, and unfortunately, some teachers may even be the worst bullies you'll ever have. This story's titled, "Throw a Book at My Head?" We'll see who has the last laugh. So this happens back in freshman year of high school for me, about 20 years ago. Little bit of a backstory. I was born with neurofibromatosis, a genetic condition that causes tumor growth on nerve endings, and a large list of other problems like early onset puberty, blindness, epilepsy, death, etc. I had this teacher who, if you called her an ancient old hag, you'd be polite. For whatever reason, she had it out for me, and I can only pin it down to her being a bully. Now, I had been sick because of my medical condition, and had action plans with the school as to not fall behind. The teacher knew of my condition because of this. So one day, I come into the classroom, and there's a depiction of me on the whiteboard, with the words, "Tumor Boy" above it. The teacher just shrugged and laughed. She had disclosed my medical condition to the entire class. I tell the principal, nothing. The guidance counselor, nothing. My parents, nothing. Nobody believes me. It's my word against hers. So for now, I let it go. I'm very patient, so I know I'll get another opportunity. Another incident. She hits my hand with a ruler when I ask her to stop taunting me in front of the other students, as my medical condition is nobody's business but my own. She tells the class that I have brain tumors, which is why my head is so large. So then, I get a case of the flu, and miss about a week of school, so I ask if I could bring a recorder to school to tape lessons to catch up. It's immediately put in my file for whatever reason. Still, it's in my file, so she should know about the agreement. So now, I know if she acts like a ranted bitch again, her ass is mine. All I need is bait, which pretty much just takes me showing up. The very next day at school, I'm sitting in class with the recorder taping in my bag. and she starts with the daily routine of asking someone to draw a picture of me and all my tumors on the whiteboard. I again ask her to stop, and this is where the book is thrown at my head with a loud thud, followed by a profanity-filled tirade about how terrible of a child I am. It's at this point I stop the recorder and tell her exactly what I think of her, and I'm then physically removed from the class and taken to the principal's office, and I'm expelled. Once I got home is when I showed my parents the tape. Within 20 minutes, we're back at the school playing it for the principal and the vice principal, threatening legal action. Needless to say, my expulsion is lifted and she's fired on the spot just before retirement, losing her retirement money. Hello friends, thanks for tuning into this episode of Reddit ProRevenge. I hope you enjoyed this story today. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button and leave a comment. If you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for future revenge stories. See you in the next one.